All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to ISCAST, a New Zealand Christians in Science conversation series, Navigating the Nexus. I'm Sarah Wilson, I'm the Program Director for ISCAST, and we're very pleased to see you here tonight, and I hope that you've enjoyed the presentation so far. I want to begin tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking from tonight. God appointed the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation to be stewards over this part of his creation, and we are grateful for the care and respect they gave to this land over many thousands of years. We pay our respects to the elders past and present. I'd like to welcome you all again, and just to quickly acknowledge the team of people who have put these conversations together. From New Zealand, we have Nicola Hoggard-Cregan, who is the Director of New Zealand Christians in Science, and Grace Cox, who's the Administrator and takes care of communications. And at ISCAST, there is Chris Mulheron, the Executive Director of ISCAST, and Brittany Spencer, who's our Digital Communications Specialists. Just a couple of points for tonight. Chris Mulheron will be facilitating the Q&A, the discussion. And we ask that during the presentation, when you think of a question, that you place it in the chat so that we can quickly get onto the discussion once our speakers finished with their presentation. Just remember to keep your computers on mute, and I will start by saying a short prayer. So please pray with me. Heavenly Father, we thank you for all the ways you have revealed yourself to us through your creation, through your Holy Scripture, and through the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We ask that you grant Andrew the clarity of thought and confidence to articulate his message with conviction, and that his knowledge might help us further reconcile our understanding of Genesis in a world dominated by the pursuit and reliance on science and technology. Bless our conversations. May they be both fruitful and honouring to you in a way that grows your kingdom here on earth. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Andrew Brown, who is a great friend of ISCAST. He grew up in the Port Stephens area of New South Wales on the eastern coast, Australian coast, I should say. He completed his undergraduate degree studies in the USA before returning to Australia to undertake Bible college teaching and youth camp ministry, along with further theological college studies. After Andrew married, he joined a pastoral team at a Baptist church and began research studies at the University of Queensland. 6 years of country pastoring at Williambar in rural northeastern New South Wales followed. Soon after his arrival at MST, he completed his PhD thesis in the reception history of the creation week in Genesis. And tonight, he's cheekily titled his presentation, Answers on Genesis and Science. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks very much. Sorry that I'm glowing here, but my picture's looking a little bit better now, just a bit incandescent. Just checking everyone can hear me and see me.
Yep, we can.
Lovely. All right. So I'm going to primarily rely on a presentation tonight, and so I'll get that started. I'll share my screen and we'll see how we go. All right. I think everyone's seeing that. Yeah, lovely. All right. So what I have in mind today is more the Genesis side than the science side, but it will become clear on why I'm doing that. So I've been looking at Calvin's commentary on Genesis, and he uses this image of a house. If the earth were destitute of animals, trees, and plants, that barren waste would have the appearance of a poor and deserted house. There was a program on the ABC the other day about Lamb House in Brisbane, and it sits up on Kangaroo Point, right above the cliffs that I used to rock climb on for many years when I was living up there. And a couple of well-to-do Brisbaneites have bought it now, and they've largely restored it. But it had fallen into such disrepair and was being lived in by squatters that it was in just this really awful state. And so I'll post this presentation for you later so you can get to the link. But when you see that story, the text version of it, it shows that squatters had kind of turned every room into a ruin. And in fact, they'd punched out stained glass windows and things like that. So this house that was really intended to be quite beautiful was in this terrible state of disrepair. That reminds me of the main reason why people talk about the created order, or one of the main reasons why there's conversation about nature in the present day, is alarm over its present condition and what humans have done to it, and fears about its future. And so I'm touching on that current context in a way so that we stay in touch with the main reason why people talk about nature kind of in the popular conversation. But I think this metaphor of the home or the house is useful for us as well. So one reason why we get into confusion in our conversations about science and Genesis and other ways that we have of understanding our origins is sometimes we're speaking at cross purposes and don't realize that we're not communicating well. So I thought of it this way. If someone came to our home as guests, we could encounter a couple of different kinds of questions. They might look around and say, you know, how was this house constructed? How old is it? Who built it? What was here when it was first constructed? And we could tell a bit of a story about its age and its materials and how it's been maintained and what state it's in the present. But if someone asked us about the story of the home, that would evoke a whole different set of questions. And perhaps the way that we're wired means that if someone asks us about our place, some of us are thinking about the house and some of us are thinking about the home and how it becomes a place for living and what relationships happen inside it and how it looks, its aesthetics. So sometimes we end up in confused conversations because one party is talking about the house and the other party is talking about the home. And I think it's really the second question when it comes to our cosmic home, when it comes to this place where we live, creation. I think it's the second question that Genesis is seeking to answer more than the first. Its purpose is not primarily to answer questions about the construction of the house, but to answer how the story of the home begins. So I'm going to make a few claims about the nature of Genesis as a text, and that will have implications for what we do with it and what we try and learn from it. So the first thing is that Genesis is accommodated. That's kind of a handy word spinning off the idea of a house, but it touches on a teaching that is certainly in Calvin's work and in famous Christian speakers like Augustine and John Chrysostom, who say that the Genesis text in particular is catered for a very wide range of readers. And so it's got a condescending quality. It does not want to be technical. God doesn't intend it to be technical. God intends it to be accessible for a wide range of readers. And so there in the same Genesis commentary where we saw that line about the house in Calvin's Genesis commentary, he speaks a lot about accommodation and a lot about the simple speech that this is a text for the uneducated or a text for the unlearned. It's not meant to hit just an elite, it's meant to hit everybody. And now that idea of accommodation was one that Calvin himself was not willing to extend to the creation week. And that's partly my focus tonight because that was the subject of my studies. So sometimes I leave people asking, more questions about the Eden narrative, the man and the woman in the garden from Genesis 2:4 to 3:24. I often end up saying less about that because my own studies at the University of Queensland and since we're in Genesis 1, but I will make some comments about it. When it came to the days of creation, Calvin was, he calls it in a 19th century translation, too violent a cavil, meaning kind of too reckless an objection to the text of Genesis 1 to say that God's accommodation was expressed in the creation week as a kind of a notional structure, not reflecting real time. Calvin couldn't go that far. He was part of the Reformation, and they were reacting against what looked like allegorical interpretations. And so he took a stand on this being a literal rendition, that God's accommodation was in the action of creation taking 7 days, not in presenting it as if it took 7 days. Now, Calvin must have to insist on that because someone else must be saying the opposite. And the two examples I can think of are Augustine at the crowning stage of the patristic period, where his literal commentary on Genesis is explicitly non-literal about the creation days. He really has creation in a moment or an instant, and the days represent cognitive cycles of angelic beings recognizing what God is doing in creation. So the days are part of they're a literary device to express something that's actually non-chronological. And then nearer to Calvin's own time, there were thinkers affected by Platonism. And one example is, I've forgotten his name. Yes, I'm not going to remember that name. There was a British scholar who had been to Italy and been affected by the Italian Renaissance. And he'd come back. I've actually written that down. I'm going to name him for you, John Colet. John Colet. And he came back and was part of a trend in British scholarship to think that the creation week was non-literal. And this is back in the 15th century, so a long time before the present. Calvin couldn't go that far. But we do have indications that Genesis is an accommodated text. In other words, that it adopts literary devices, it adopts figures of speech for the sake of better communication. So what are some of those accommodated kinds of speech? In general, I'm giving it the label that Genesis is anthropomorphic. So when it talks about God, it speaks about God anthropomorphically in human figures. And so we have what I'm calling the figure of the clay. Genesis 2:7, God molds humans out of clay. This is clearly not a literal statement, but it pictures creation according to a metaphor that's used in other parts of the Old Testament for creation. The Hebrew word is yotzer, and the images of a potter forming things out of clay. We have the figure of the garden, God planting a garden. And again, that's not an actual physical action. And in fact, the figure of God, I think, is presented in king-like terms in this entire set of chapters early in Genesis. And so even then, the king never plants the garden, or in Persian, the paradise, doesn't do that work himself. He gets, underlings to do that work, but he's responsible for it. In all, it remains a figure. We have the figure of God talking back and forth to human characters. We have the figure of walking in the garden in 3:8. And I'm arguing that also in Genesis 1, which overall is less imaginative in its language, it still has a figure of the lapse of a day and a daily cycle through a week. I would argue that that is meant to suggest a work week, a constructive work week, such as on a building project. So if we have these obvious anthropomorphisms in Genesis 2 and 3, I'd argue that we have a lead there to interpret the days of creation 1 as anthropomorphic as well. And we have other figural elements that don't relate to presentation of God, but also suggest we're not dealing with a blow-by-blow historical narrative. The rivers of the middle of Genesis 2, they're a bit of they straddle the fence because they sound realistic. They seem to refer to known geography, and at the same time, they all converge to a point. And that doesn't sound like a straightforward geographic reference. We have trees of life and of knowledge and a snake entering into conversation. And in the end, we have a garden guarded by cheruvim in Hebrew. And I've seen scholarship that argues, as I suspect, that Hebrew keruvim is where we get the English word ultimately griffin via the Greek. All right, so you can imagine griffins are guarding this garden. This is not kind of a standard history of human affairs. Genesis is also antique. So sometimes those who want to take Genesis too literally aren't recognizing or aren't acknowledging that it is from another age and addressing another group of people. So an ancient text addressed to an alien culture, alien to us, and that culture and the writer, really, humanly speaking, are unacquainted with the data and the debates of our present age. They can't, even the writer of Genesis, can't take part in the kinds of scientific discussions we want to have because they're not aware of them. And so maybe someone with a high view of scripture could challenge back and say, well, the human author can't be aware of them, but what about, God is capable of being aware of the realities of the natural world. Yes, but if God were to express those in the terms that we understand in our 21st century position, that would make Genesis inscrutable for 20 centuries of past Bible readers and listeners, not to say maybe 30 centuries, and then going forward, it would very soon be redundant for future centuries. So it would be rather conceited of us to expect God to tailor the description of physical origins in early Genesis just to what we know and what we believe as if we are the chosen generation. And the first generation that was meant to read and understand this didn't matter, nor most of the subsequent ones. So Genesis cannot address the paradigms held by each generation in its own time. And that means it's going to operate with some things that we wouldn't accept today in terms of its broader assumptions. An antique cosmology, I don't know what else to call a firmament because we need a real word for it, but firmament's out of date, but we haven't replaced it with anything. The Hebrew is rakia, and it's this idea of an interface between the earthly realm and the heavenly realm. You can't fly a spaceship out and find that. It's not there. And there's no layer of waters above the firmament, and the sun, moon, and stars aren't embedded in the firmament. So there is an antique cosmology used. There's a telescoped chronology that treats human and terrestrial origins as coterminous, right? Starting, you could say, at the same time. There's a limited geography that really speaks as if it's speaking of the whole world, but it's speaking of the known world to Israel. And there are stylized genealogies that express lifespans using symbolic numbers. And particularly, I would say that a base 60 mathematical system seems to be driving the lifespans in the genealogies of Genesis 5. And that was true for the Sumerian king list, an ancient document with really super inflated kingly reigns, but they all break down and divide by 60 or by 60 squared by 3,600. So it's a base 60 number system. So you have literature that's operating in ways that we don't do anymore because it's operating in the terms and according to the literary rules of a different age. But I would praise Genesis for its tremendous versatility given its age. If you compare ancient Near Eastern myths of origins that are roughly contemporary with Genesis, having cosmologies like Enuma Elish, where the cosmos comes from the goddess Tiamat being split in half like a flat fish, and half of her becoming the earth and half of her becoming the heaven, you get an idea of the versatility of Genesis 1, say, in contrast to its rival texts for origin stories. Genesis is archetypal, and this ties into a presentation I gave at COSAC in the end of 2022 at Ridley College about misunderstood words in Genesis. And so I'm saying, not like John Walton, who says that the description of creation is kind of purely functional in Genesis 1. I think there's a physical element as well. and things that in other competing stories are expressed quite mythologically. So there's a Mesopotamian myth of the origin of the hoe, the farming implement, and it's just given from a god out of the sky, right? That's where the hoe comes from. It's dropped from heavens by a god. But where does that kind of technology come from in Genesis? The end of Genesis 4 attributes that kind of thing, metalworking, to human ingenuity, right? Technology doesn't come from the gods and drop from the sky. It actually comes from the initiative of created human beings. So it's the mythology compared to prior models is well dialed down in early Genesis. It remains versatile by being generic, and it remains versatile by using archetypal characters. I think this stands out when you read the Hebrew and understand what these words mean. But for a long time in Genesis, I would say up until Genesis 4:26, when the word Adam is used, I would argue that it's never a proper name until Genesis 4:26. All but 3 times it has the article, which means the Adam, the human, and it can only really be a name, common sense, because Hebrew works like English, we don't put a "the" before our name because our name is already a proper noun. It's already specific, right? And so the same thing is true in Hebrew. You don't need to put "the" before it when it's a name. So the fact that it has "the" before it, and there's a special case in there, but I think I would argue this about that too, means that we should really translate, I think, the human until the word occurs in Genesis 4:26, which is a long way down the track. If we realize we were reading about the human and then a female figure called Life and their eldest son called Smith, as in metalsmith, that's the meaning of Cain. He has a grandson called Humanity, Enosh, and ultimately Noah, his kind of favored son, has the name Shem, as in Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem is the word for name. So if you called one of your kids name, that's a very odd thing to do. It's very generic. And really all of these kinds of names are generic and archetypal. They seem to stand for ideas, but on the other hand, they're woven into a genealogy that leads down towards a genealogy of actual human beings as well. Going a little bit further, I'm sticking with my A's, but I'm cheating by using another language. I'm saying Genesis is aletheis, which is the Greek word for true. And I'm saying it's true to purpose. It does what it is intended to do, what its divine author intends it to do. And so to start with a quote and then end with a quote for this last section, Calvin says who would learn astronomy and other recondite arts. At the time, astronomy and astrology were really in the same basin, the same category. But Calvin doesn't disallow that just because there's the suspicion of superstition around it. He says, he who would learn those, let him go elsewhere. That's not what Genesis is doing. So to reiterate my metaphor, the Genesis text is talking about the home and not the house, primarily. It's not ruling out physical origins, but it's not expressing the method of creation of physical origins. If Genesis 1 is particularly reticent about that, let there be and there is really tells you nothing about method. It's decisively not doing that. So I'm saying in a kind of a fairly non-concordist position, we will need sciences subject to Christian philosophical critique to learn about physical and biological origins, all kinds of origins, the questions that we want to ask. But if we're going to let Genesis do what it wants to do, what its intention seems to be, we've got to learn these theological lessons, that God exists and that God is one, that God wills, acts, interacts with this creation, communicates, both chose to create realities other than himself and made those realities personal. So God was choosing relationship. I think of this along the lines of deciding to have children for young parents, for a young couple. You can decide to have, another piece of furniture in your house. You can decide to have, a new room or a games room. You can decide to do all these sorts of things to your house. But when you decide to introduce new human beings into it, when you decide to have a child, you are deciding for relationship. Right? It's a very creation-like decision. You are not just choosing a new object for your house, you are choosing to have a relationship. So for creation to include humans means God is going looking for relationship and taking all the risks involved in giving those new, willing, self-determining entities their own wills. All the risks, all the difficulties of relationship, all the risks in a way that parents take when they have a child, knowing that they might have a rambunctious teenager, or they might suffer some sadness or some tragedy when something happens to their child. It's a choice for relationship with all the risks involved. Now, on that third last point, you might remember the famous photo taken by scientists from the Apollo 17. It's called the Blue Marble, and it just shows planet Earth with Africa kind of dead center, looking so blue and so kind of inviting. I sometimes imagine an interstellar traveler crossing the systems by who knows what faster than light transport method to make this illustration work. And they've checked planet after planet and moon after moon, and all they find is desolate, frozen, cold ones, and intensely hot ones, and gaseous ones with no surface. And I can just imagine thousand upon thousand of such uninhabitable places, and then finally lobbing into our solar system on this quest and seeing the blue marble and just realizing at first glance, wow, that looks like a place made for life. That looks like a place friendly to life. And it is. Genesis 1 pictures the planet kind of teeming with life, and even the land and the seas authorized to do some of their own producing, right? There's a bit of agency hinted at there. The earth gets to generate life. The waters get to generate life. And God is pleased when it's just swarming with living creatures. And yet when humans arrive, they're arriving not as intruders whose very presence is an interference with nature by definition, but they're arriving as the intended occupants. So we're kind of against the current mood in discussions about nature. I think that Genesis encourages us not to see human beings as intruders who are by definition going to wreck this place just by being in it. We don't have to, but we have to choose to live in it as stewards rather than squatters. So if you go and investigate that story about Lamb House, check the before and after shots before the restoration happens and then after, and you'll see rooms full of debris and smashed out stained glass windows, things that were supposed to be beautiful that are left looking ruined and devastated by the same species for whom the house was built. So the house is not intended to be destroyed. It's actually meant to be enjoyed, but the very creatures who are meant to enjoy it and best positioned to enjoy it, even by the way that they're made, are also capable of ruining it if they lose their discipline and if they lose their respect for the maker and just kind of rampage through it. So John Chrysostom again says about our presence in creation, finally, after arranging everything in order, preparing a lavish table laden with wealth and abundance, then finally, he creates the being meant to enjoy all these things. So it's possible to have a positive view of human value and a positive view of the value of creation. Those things don't have to be incompatible. And if this is God's grand house, we've got to believe it's possible to restore it and be careful not to give younger generations the impression that there's no way back from its current state and there's no avoiding its ruin. It's really important to recognize the problem that anxiety represents for young people today and not destroy their hope, I think, that creation can be redeemed. The Bible would say it's God's intention to redeem it, to bring it back from its damage. And we should have room in our understanding of fallenness for the current state of the world in its damage and pollution and risk. We should incorporate that theologically as well. So what about science? We're really left free to go and find out what the process was that God used to create, but we're meant to be under no illusions as to whose house we're living in and how we're meant to live. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting, Andrew. Now, because I'm doing a bit of comparing here, let me ask my question first. That's really pushing in, isn't it? So, Andrew, why haven't modern translations, if we've got the man, why haven't modern translations taken the plunge? Is it because they're just too nervous about that huge change?
Yeah, we're in a bit of a bind as translators because we also have a New Testament, and in the New Testament, we have the bridge from the Old to the New Testament via the Greek translation, the Septuagint. Now, what the Septuagint and even the Latin Vulgate and other versions do is treat the character Adam, capital A, proper noun, as coming in a lot earlier. So even in the process of translation, the meaning of a text begins to migrate. And then someone like, well, most of the New Testament writers, when they're doing their interpretation, they're really interpreting under the influence of the Septuagint and often just reading directly the Septuagint. Paul's capable of using both, but he follows this trend of understanding an individual human character to come in much earlier when he makes arguments such as he makes in Romans 5. So our current translators, they're faced with a little bit of a dilemma. They're probably aware of the fact that we have what is a common noun or sometimes a collective noun operating in the early chapters of Genesis, but are a bit between a rock and a hard place because to really translate it generically for all that time would seem to put shade on Paul's interpretation in the New Testament in particular.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, that's very interesting. Yeah. Now, Sarah, you had a question, didn't you?
Yeah, look, it wasn't a very deep question. I was just sort of more a personal one, just to ask whether what was your position on Genesis before you began these research studies? Did you have a bias, or were you brought up with a certain kind of theology?
Yeah, that's a good question, Sarah, because our backgrounds always play a role, don't they? So I was brought up in a family home where my mother in particular was a diehard young earth creationist. And my ambition when I was a 16-year-old was to go and work for, Creation Ministries. Now, I was interested in science, and actually those two things, in principle, initially are not incompatible. There would be other people involved even in advocating young earth creation because they like scientific things. But I did want to think about what I was observing. And over the years, I was very interested, particularly in inanimate processes. I used to collect minerals growing up and look at rocks and think about their formation. And particularly, probably in the about 20 years ago and a broad band either side of that, wherever I lived, I was studying the geological maps for those regions. So this is particularly the Brisbane region and then northeastern New South Wales, and thinking about whether there was any possibility of the formation of those regions, given their rock subtypes, substratas. How could they form in a very compact period? Like basically, young earth creationism basically puts almost all the formation of rocks that aren't very simple in the band of the flood in 12 months. And I was trying to imagine how could that be possible. I already couldn't see it in looking at the Brisbane Basin, but the real clincher for me was living in Murwillumbah. Murwillumbah is inside an eroded volcano. It's a grand erosion caldera. It's about 50 kilometres across. If you count all of the extruded material on the outside, it reaches from the Gold Coast to down past Nimbin, and it's about 80 kilometres across. It would have originally been about 2,500 metres in elevation, before erosion began, and the erosion has gone all the way down through the volcanic deposits into the sedimentaries underneath in the region around Mount Warning. So that's more than 2,000 kilometres of vertical erosion. And so looking at the constitution of the rocks there, you had Brisbane Basin sediments down really deep, big inclined and very thick sedimentary deposits. And then you actually had a volcanic deposit of an older stage. Then all of that had been sheared off or eroded down. And then you had this Tweed Shield volcano with time to build up more than 2 vertical kilometres of body, and then eroded all the way back down through those 2 kilometres in places. And, you know, it was just so obvious to me that doesn't fit in 12 months. It doesn't fit in 12,000 years. It doesn't, you know, like the common sense stops at a certain number of zeros, but it goes way beyond 3 zeros. And so for me, that was really the clincher. And then Creation Ministries actually had a speaker come to that area hosted by a local ministry. And I went to hear that speaker. And I just was willing to kind of give him the chance to explain this, you know. So I just sort of posed the question. And there was a bit of a hitman on the side, you know, like I had a bit of a tough guy defender in case the speaker got in trouble, and he kind of shut me down. But I wasn't trying to be belligerent. I just wanted to see if the speaker had thought through a scenario. And he was trying to think on his feet, which meant he'd actually never thought about this. And I sort of thought, it seems basic scientific curiosity to me when you go and speak about the physical history of a region that you would, and your profession is geology, that you would have thought about its geological history and have some explanation for it on your model. And so for me, that seemed to manifest a fundamental lack of curiosity. And sometimes that is the product of having your answers already predetermined. And so you don't have any real questions. And scientifically, that was problematic for me and kind of sealed the deal.
And interestingly, though, it didn't rock your faith. It enabled you to integrate that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've sort of got an all truth is God's truth kind of position. Yep. You know, we don't need to run from reality. We've got to have our eyes open. So any stance we take that involves basically plugging our ears with our fingers is not an adequate stance.
Yeah,
I don't think.
Great. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Sarah, for that good question. Andrew Doubleday, I don't know if you want to make any more comment. You've made a brief comment there, again referring to Adam. Is that how we pronounce it? How do we know how to? Yeah. Andrew said, go ahead, Andrew.
It was just a book I read about 3 decades ago, God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality by Phyllis Tribble. And I think it's very, very useful. She sort of really takes the same line as Andrew does and suggests that until the same point I think that Andrew identifies, that the earth creature, Ha-Adam, the red earth, is in fact androgynous. And I think suggests that at the point of separation, this is where the 2 parts of human sexuality were separated, that until that point, this being was both male and female. I just found it really quite useful.
So let me comment on that. It gets a little bit I think that position can be overdrawn, but I think the writer is doing something super clever. There are 3 basic meanings for Adam in the early chapters of Genesis. There is a common noun reference to a single character, the human. There is also a category type meaning, a humanity, which is the first use in Genesis 1:26. Let us make humanity in our own image. I think that's basically the generic use or collective use. And then there's the proper noun use, Adam. And the writer sets up these meanings in deliberate plurality because already more than one of those meanings is being used in Genesis 1:26 and 27. And then in Genesis 5:1 and 2, as the genealogy gets going, they're actually used in multiple ways once again. So the writer is setting up a creative tension between humanity, the category, the representative or archetypal human and the head figure of the genealogy that's going to lead to Israel, right? These things are in this, like a triple star system in a controlled orbit. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. And thanks, Andrew. Charles, would you like to pipe up?
Yes. Thank you, Andrew. You mentioned about the humans restoring the creation, like that house in Brisbane was being restored. Do you see that as just a complete building up from chaos into an ordered creation, or are the humans to restore, work on the creation, getting back to an ideal creation in the beginning, or what?
Yeah. It's a good question, because I think this affects our ethical response to climate change and environmental damage and that kind of thing. And I think others will have looked into this a bit more deeply than me. I know there are some good writings on creation just in the last few years that work on making the connection, and I haven't read enough of that stuff. But the metaphor of the house, well, first of all, I think you can show, even in things that Paul says in the New Testament, that God wishes not to abandon this physical world, but to restore it, along with our restoration. There's an analogy between the human body, that physical resurrection, and the restoration of the rest of physical creation. Both are intentions of God's plan in the way it's presented biblically. So it seems to me that, as with most aspects of salvation, we kind of need God's help in some sense. We're not capable of fixing all of our own problems. So there is an intervention, even like the first element that's needed is God's intervention, and how that looks at the resurrection, in a way we wait to see. But it seems to then imply that what would I do in reaction to creation now, knowing that it is God's craftsmanship and valuable to him? Well, I would probably seek to redress what damage I could. I would probably seek to have a positive influence on the environment, a positive contribution to efforts to fix things and reverse damage. And I might not have a great deal of power, but I'd rather be pulling in the right direction. I'd rather show my respect for the Creator in what I do to his house, rather than be a part of the neglect and the damage. So it has ethical outcomes, I think.
Thanks, Andrew. Why don't we hand over to Sally? Are you there, Sally? I'm looking for you, Sally. There you are. Sally, you're going to follow that up, aren't you?
Yeah. Great talk, Andrew. My experience is trying to get Christians, particularly evangelical Christians, to understand the importance of caring for creation. They've just got so many presuppositions stuck in their very neo-Gnostic worldview. I'm just wondering what your experience of how to help people like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit of a novice in those kinds of conversations. I think the feeling has been, I think the nervousness is associated with the way that conservative Christians have seen sometimes Christian organizations that started out devoted to gospel causes, go on this mission drift and end up in philanthropy or environmental help, but some of these kinds of things, and seem to kind of lose their vision for the more direct kind of conversion and rescue of a soul as well, and so they feel sensitive or feel nervous about this loss of what makes the Christian message distinctive, and sometimes see Christians whose main game becomes one of these other issues. So I think it would allay those fears a little bit if they can see people who can show the compatibility of showing good care for God's creation without turning an environmental concern into entirely their main game and no longer really having a major place in their worldview and their personal efforts for introducing people to relationship with God, you know, that work of reconciliation. They shouldn't be incompatible, but as human beings, we have this tendency to only be able to focus on one thing very well. So we need to do better than that at reconciling these things. I just see nothing incompatible about living respectfully and reverently in God's house and serving him in that house, you know, and trying to bring other people to see, you know, don't live in it like a squatter or don't live in it like a poor lost soul. Get to know the owner and maker and the architect of the house.
Yeah, I'm a director of Rocha Christian Conservation. So we try very hard to make sure it's got a Christian basis in all that we do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's no reason why that should be incompatible. Yeah.
It's over 50 years, I think, since 1970, when John Stott reprimanded evangelicals for separating social gospel from preaching the gospel, isn't it? We, they, depending on which camp you put yourself in, should have learned by now. Thanks very much, Sally. Now, who else have we got to make a comment here? Philip, maybe did you want to say anything more, Philip, or just draw attention to that comment there?
No, not really. Just saying there are one or two modern versions that do delay the use of the word Adam, and the Young's literal translation, which is quite an old, I can't remember when that came out, but that delays the word use of the name for until chapter 4. So it is possible. Some of those have been accepted by evangelicals.
Yeah, that's right. There is a special argument around 3 forms where Adam has a preposition on the front end. There's 1 in chapter 2 and 2 in chapter 3. And the Masoretic text, the typical text that we normally use, doesn't put the vowel for the article under the preposition. And so some versions end up choosing those as the point where a proper noun kicks in as well. And with some justification, but I think that because it's only those forms that have the preposition, I think they're probably meant to be understood as generic as well, as if they have the article.
Thanks,
and it's the double meaning of both Eve and Adam, and the word play with the earth and the living.
Yeah. So that's something an English translator is not capable of showing, you know, because it's a deliberate ambiguity, but the translator can't pick sort of both a name and a generic meaning when it comes to it. So Eve, when her name is introduced, it doesn't have the article, so it's already a name in chapter 3, but it is, or when that name is introduced, I should say, in 3:20, but it still is an archetypal name. It's life. So ideally, we could call the character life with a capital L.
Can't call her Earth Mother very easily.
Yeah, because there is a problem of drifting off into goddess worship, actually. I think. Yeah.
Thanks, Philip. We don't have any more questions in the chat, but people are welcome to put their hand up or simply to unmute and pipe up if you've got a comment or a question, and I'll try to notice that. Thanks. Charles, go ahead.
Yes, just on the use of Adam as generic and name, how you obviously take the view it goes from generic to proper name. There is examples of the reverse, like Quisling. Quisling was the name of a person, and it's now become a generic word for a traitor to your nation. The way Quisling was working for the Nazis against his country, Norway. Is it possible that also happened? in Genesis.
I suppose that would probably force you to take that position that Hebrew is the archetypal language, you know, like the primordial language. It would be pretty difficult to sustain that in any way that was compatible, I think, with what's known of the origin of languages. You know, from what's known in the ancient Near East, you know, there are languages that predate Hebrew that are older than it. So I think probably that might be a misconstrued solution.
I don't follow you, because in the case of Quisling, it happened in either Norwegian or English, which is definitely not archetypal in any sense. And does Hebrew need to be the first language for that phenomenon to occur in it, such as Adam, Eve, Enosh, and the rest?
Well, I mean, I guess not. I don't know how you'd prove it.
But to say that Adam is the original name, Adam, a Hebrew word, is the original name of the person, when there are Ugaritic texts and others that long precede Hebrew, would be to make an assumption that the Hebrews were the primeval people on earth, if that was his name.
Yes, the name works in Hebrew, so that's kind of what you've been claiming. It's kind of a Renaissance view, you know, that Renaissance cultures for a while were really fascinated with Hebrew because they thought of it as the primordial language, and so they wanted to learn it. They were looking for the language that perfectly expressed the reality of things. And so they sort of figured, well, it must be Hebrew. It's there in Genesis, you know. But it doesn't really allow sufficiently for the creativity of the writer, I think.
Would anyone else like to make a comment? Okay. I'll ask another question. Andrew, I've been in a school this week. We've seen all the secondary students at Scotch College here in Melbourne. We've had somewhere between 2 and 4 hours with each year level. So it's been pretty intense. One of the questions that always comes up when we talk about science and faith is evolution and creation, Genesis 1, evolution, that sort of thing. And my standard response, and I'd like you to help me with my standard response, because, you know, this is a standard response that's suitable for year 7 students, not the current group of people present tonight. My standard response is about genres, about literary types. I say, if you go into the physics classroom and the physics teacher hands out copies of Harry Potter and says, get on with your physics, you're going to be pretty confused. And the first port of call is to work out what sort of literature you're dealing with. I ask the rhetorical question, do you think that the author of Genesis was trying to teach us science? And then I get a bit more reluctant because, you know, I'm not a Hebrew scholar or anything like that, and it's a long time since I've even looked at Genesis in that sort of serious way. My understanding is it wouldn't be right to call Genesis poetry. You could say there's figurative language there. How would you go on responding to that year 7 student?
Yeah. So one thing I do mention in my first book is that there are other examples within the Old Testament of expressing narrative action that comes to a climax in terms of a number and then that number plus 1, right? Some people call it the x plus 1 pattern. And you can find examples using all kinds of base numbers, but you do have other narratives that use the 6th day and then the climactic 7th day pattern, like, you know, the conquest of Jericho in the book of Joshua, or happens over 6 days with the climax on the 7th day. You see the same narrative device actually in Ugaritic stories about Baal, you know, the Baal cycle, things like that. And in fact, they're applied to the flood in, I think it's the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the boat, the corresponding boat in that story, lodges on a mountain. Well, it's adrift in the waters, I think, for the 6 days. And then on the climactic 7th day, lodges on the local mountain. And so it's a familiar narrative device to express action that comes to a climax. So you've then either got to decide, well, you know, do I think that in this case it's actually describing the origin of the world in a literal fashion, or does our writer have the freedom to explain creation with that sort of accommodation principle at work, and the freedom to utilize this 6-7 day literary motif as a way to characterize the building, I would say, the constructive work of God in that first panel of the Genesis story. And so I think it is a genre question. And I think what we're dealing with is the need to express creation in a way that people could manage, and not just in one generation, but over many generations. And so because Genesis 1 is actually so reserved, it has so little to say about method or process, that it sets us free to go and discover method and process. But we want to think theologically about that. And so when we're thinking theologically, do we have any biblical warrant for saying, along with God's ability to do things miraculously and instantly, does God ever take time in the work of creation? If we say he never does, then where we're stuck is that we can never own our own existence as a work of creation. But you've got, you know, Psalm 139 and Job 9 and 10 and Job 31. You've got these Old Testament passages, even James, I think, spot in James, that talks about individual people as God's creative products. And if that's the case, then clearly God is quite willing to grow things to maturity as a creative undertaking. So you've got theological warrant for saying God is free to do something suddenly or something slowly. And that gives us permission, I think, to look around and say, well, planet Earth could have, sprung into existence in a puff of smoke. But when I dig below the dirt, what I see is evidence of a history. I see a kind of a narrative history built into the rock strata. And so theologically, I'm free to acknowledge that might have had a developmental story. I can take notice of it. I'm not compelled to ignore it. Next step then is biology, I think.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, we better finalise our meeting for tonight. I'm sorry, Gillian, we better wind up, but hold that question and maybe we can go back to that question once we wind up formally. I'd love to do 2 advertisements for ISCAST things coming up. We've now set the date for COSAC, our biennial conference. It will happen the last weekend in November in Sydney at New College. And it will deal with human anthropology. What is a human being in the light of AI, transhumanism, questions about gender, etc. So that's the last weekend in November. It'd be great if everybody could get to Sydney then. And for anybody near Brisbane or with friends in Brisbane, on June the 22nd, in about 3 weeks, we're repeating the AI conference, the AI seminar, a 3-hour, 2.5-hour seminar with Neil Dodgson. Will be back from New Zealand in Australia. He's an expert, a computer expert, AI expert. So that's on June the 22nd. Details on the ISCAST website. Andrew, you might like to advertise something too.
Yes, I'd love to. So we're running a short conference on a creation theme here at MST, August 9th and 10th. It's a Friday evening and a Saturday. ISCAST is quite thoroughly involved, supplying a number of speakers, including all the way down to Tony Ronaldo to speak about that sort of practical end of being involved in the healing end of creation involvement, but also Chris himself and Sarah and Michael Clark. and another member, another fellow, Paul Tyson. So there's a lot of ISCAST involvement, but it's really to think through theologically the issues of creation. We're hearing from some other good speakers like David Ferguson, who's written a lot on the theology of creation. So it's not expensive. You can, via our website, find us, maybe search MST and Paradosis, but we'd love to have you as well.
And the date is?
9th of August and 10th of August, the Friday evening and the Saturday.
Great. Thank you. Nicola, do you want to tell New Zealanders about anything?
Well, we have some lectures coming up in Auckland. We've got on the 12th of June, we have a lecture by Professor Heidi Campbell, just visiting from Texas on misinformation and I've forgotten the exact title, but something to do with technology and the media and Christianity. And then on the 19th of June, we have a book launch for something called Restorying the Story, which is this book by Anne Van Gent, where she interacts with science fiction and fantasy to rethink the whole story of redemption. And then on July the 10th, we have Gina Kuru, who's from the United States, who's speaking about doing social science research with Christianity, especially to do with demographics. So yes, 3 lectures coming up. Yeah, all in Auckland though.
Great. Thank you. Let me pray briefly and we'll close the meeting. God our Father, Creator God, we give you thanks. We give you thanks for the creation, and we give you thanks for the understanding of that we have of your creation through your written word. May the creation lead us to praise and worship. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I look forward to seeing you next time.